Her and EU, a European podcast on gender equality, brought to you by the Martens Centre with Loredana Teodorescu.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Her and EU, a new podcast on gender equality and women's role in the society. Despite significant progress, women are still underrepresented in many positions that shape politics, economics, and society. And how is this affecting all of us? What are the main obstacles, and what can be done to overcome them? We want to address this issue from different angles, and today we will discuss women in think tanks. Think tanks are indeed key influencers of public policy, but are they reflecting the diversity of the society in their research, analysis, and engagement in public debates? I'm Loredana Teodorescu, Research Associate at the Martens Centre for European Studies. I'm also the Head of EU and International Affairs at Istituto Luigi Sturzo in Rome, and the Secretary General of Women in International Security Italy, also known as WISE. Today with me, I have the perfect guest for this topic, Rosa Balfour, Director at Carnegie Europe. Rosa, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Loredana, for inviting me.
Rosa, you have an impressive career as a woman in leading positions in think tanks, now at Carnegie, before that, among others, heading the European Policy Centre in Brussels. So I'd like to start with your very own personal experience. So looking back, how being a woman has affected your career? Was it ever an obstacle in some ways, or on the contrary, let's say, an advantage?
Well, it was definitely never an advantage. When I joined the think tank community, it was very male-dominated. There were fewer women working in this sector, and it was hard. It was hard for us. If you in the coffee breakout at a conference, young women were treated as tapestry, invisible. You really had to step up to be heard, and you had to argue your point very forcefully to be paid, to be taken seriously. I think probably for most of us, it was really difficult to be taken seriously by the mostly white-haired men that dominated the conversation. However, having said this, I was fortunate because I've always worked in environments with very nice colleagues and very nice supervisors who have done two things. They've been supportive, and they've also made me more aware of when I actually needed to be assertive in order to get my voice through. There's one thing I have to say, which I don't think it's necessarily female, but I know a lot of women who share this, the kind of imposter syndrome. What am I doing here? This sense of insecurity, lack of confidence, which, however, has also driven me to work harder. I mean, I was already in a think tank when I started doing my PhD, and I felt that I needed to do it part-time whilst working in order to affirm my validity, to my expertise, to prove, that I needed that sort of expertise. Many men in think tanks don't have PhDs, probably some women as well. But I think that's something that, on the one hand, it reflects a lack of confidence. On the other, it drove me to be, to focus very much on my expertise and to embark on a project, a real research project, which I think helped me, help my career, help my professional development.
So you worked hard, you had to overcome some lack of confidence as many women, but you've been also, as you were saying, fortunate in a way, meeting people who encouraged or supported you. And certainly you made it. But are you an exception? What is the overall situation? I'm particularly referring here to a research that you published together with Corinna Horst and other experts, precisely on women in European think tanks, asking yourself if they are or not absent influencers. So what are the main findings of your research, and are European think tanks giving an equal space and an equal voice to women?
No, the findings are that the think tank environment is very attractive to men and women alike. So at entry level, you have roughly 50% men, 50% women. But when you look at the leadership of think tanks, it's still overwhelmingly male. All the presidents of the think tanks that we surveyed across the EU are male, and 3/4 of the directors are male. So what we see is that actually climbing up the ladder of the think tank hierarchy is harder for women than it is for men. And so that's the main finding. The other is that where you do have women who reach leadership positions, it tends to be on administration, events organization, communications, finance perhaps, and less so in the content. So the research and analysis continues to be overwhelmingly male. And this means that there are objective issues. Now, I remember one of my first tweets was of a panel, a directors panel at a think tank forum that was bringing together several European think tanks, and they were all men. Now, perhaps there might be one or two. It was a very large panel of the sort that we tend not to do any longer with, 10 speakers. But now, if we were to do a panel like that, of the 10 speakers, only 3 would be women. And, 10 years ago, whenever it is that I did this tweet, they were all men. So things are changing, but they're changing rather slowly.
Yes, I think that's very interesting to give us an overall picture. Indeed, women are present, are working in think tanks, but let's not forget they are not always in the position to be, let's say, real influencers. So it's important to point it out because we are somehow missing a point of view in our discussions and reflections. And what about women like you with an expertise in foreign policy or security? I mean, is the situation somehow different for them?
No, I mean, there are several areas, and we also looked at this when we were doing research for that paper. There's several areas where there are very few women. Economics is the worst. I mean, the think tanks that focus on economics, some of them are entirely male. Foreign and security policy is also quite male-dominated. And then if you move towards themes such as human rights, social rights, cultural issues, that's where there are more women. So there's a bit of a sort of stronger presence of women in subjects that are considered softer subjects, whereas the harder subjects still are very male-dominated. I think the other thing to add is that the think tank environment, and certainly the foreign and security policy environment, is very competitive, and it's full of prima donnas, male prima donnas, and it's very difficult to find space and to have voice. So you really have to stand out, and that is something that one learns along the way, how difficult that is. But yes, certainly foreign and security policy is an area full of prima donnas. It's there's perhaps some attraction to it because of travel opportunities, because of media exposure, which makes it hard, for instance, for shy people to come out. So it is very dominated by men.
And can you tell us a little bit more about the consequences of this situation? I mean, how does it affect the role that think tanks can still play today based on your experience?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is that think tanks claim to be innovative. If you look at the websites of the various think tanks, all of them will say we are ahead of the curve, we are innovative, we have new ideas that we bring to the policy circle. All think tanks make that claim. And the question is, how can you be innovative if you're actually representing a very small proportion of the population? And that is, I think, the reason for which it's absolutely critical that think tanks embrace a degree of diversity in order to be open and listening to a variety of points of views, so that when they engage with policy circles, which themselves tend to be elitist and closed, think tanks can actually bring different perspectives from different sectors of society. So when I speak of diversity, I mean, with Corinna, for that paper, we looked at the role of women in think tanks, but this is by no means exhaustive. I mean, we also need to think about social variety. We also need, diversity. We need to think about different perspectives, including ethnicity, religion, social extraction. It break the mold whereby this think tank environment is really an elitist, cosmopolitan, polyglot community only. Otherwise, how can think tanks really make the claim that they can be innovative? It's a bit of a contradiction in terms if think tanks themselves are not renewing. I mean, the other striking feature when we did the research for the paper is that if you look at political parties, European Union institutions, many of them, not all, many of them have actually adopted policies to encourage the participation of women. And they have been ahead of the curve by comparison to think tanks. It's only recently, very recently, that most think tanks would be ashamed of proposing all-male panels. But up until 3 or 4 years ago, that was happening all the time. And in certain European countries, it still happens and nobody even notices. So there's a lot more that can be done and should be done if think tanks would want to be true to their mission of being creative and engaging with policy circles by bringing different perspectives from different parts of society.
And following up on this, do you have some concrete proposals or recommendations? I mean, in order to promote a stronger inclusion of women in think tanks, also in leadership and content-related positions? I know that we could discuss this for hours, so maybe you can give us, 2 or 3 suggestions.
Yes, I can. But let me just underline that the think tanks are kind of the tip of the iceberg, because before getting into a think tank, people will have gone to universities and they will have done postgraduate degrees. And that's in a way where that is, and then of course, before that, school. And if academic institutions are not producing enough female graduates in economics or in international relations, then it's going to be hard for think tanks to hire them. So there's a problem at source, which needs to be addressed. But think tanks too can play their part. There are a number of things. The first, I think, in light of our findings that it appears that women don't make it quite as easily up the hierarchy of think tanks, I think it's very important to create incentives for mentoring, for supporting women to take their next career step, for identifying the opportunities. I mean, sometimes the bias is not just the old men out there, it's also women themselves who don't feel appropriate to apply for certain jobs. So I think that at one level, more mechanisms can be found to encourage professional growth within think tanks. Another, and this I have to say was critical for me, I've never actually been particularly career oriented, so I've never tried to climb up the hierarchy. But what I have done is build networks with peers who, not even support group, but just friends, people who appreciate your work, and people who support you in need. And that network has been very important to me to help me say, it was a friend a female friend who said, Rosa, you should apply for this job as director of Carnegie Europe. Otherwise, I wouldn't have done that. And that sort of support is absolutely critical, and it also helps professional growth. The other thing that think tanks can do is perhaps widen the range of outlets where jobs are posted, advertised, and target universities which perhaps are not necessarily in the mold of the type of people that tends to join think tanks. So perhaps reach out to academic institutions that have more women or have a greater percentage of people from different ethnic and religious backgrounds. Open up a bit. Also, perhaps some think tanks could open up more to foreigners, even though there are language barriers, which are understandable, but a lot of the work we do is actually in English. So, one can envisage the possibility of having foreigners working in national think tanks. Why not? This is also something that has gone very, very slowly. It's a change that has gone very slow, is taking place, but very, very slowly. So these are just 3 practical steps that think tanks can take in order to address this imbalance.
Yeah, indeed, there are things that can and should be done. They are connected, as you pointed out, to education, culture, mindset, awareness, networks. And as we are speaking about women shaping our societies of today and tomorrow, before concluding this conversation, I would like to briefly mention the ongoing reflection on the future of Europe and the contribution that women experts can bring to it. So what is your main proposal for Europe's way forward?
So the conference on the future of Europe started off on the wrong track. It was postponed because of the coronavirus pandemic. Then we had, we saw several institutional rivalries, a lot of men, by the way, in the leading positions. And this is a bit of a déjà vu, the sort of squabbles that take place whenever EU representatives and leaders meet to discuss how to reform the institutions. I think the focus should be less on the end result, but more perhaps on process. The reason I say this is that we are going through a period of great contestation of the concept of the EU itself. So it's really not a question of finding a bargain between the old ideologies of federalism versus intergovernmentalism. It has to be about something different. So what I'd like the conference on the future of Europe to host is really inclusive discussions and engagements with a wide variety of citizens and groups and organizations for really just to open boxes rather than try and close them, and engage in a process of, shall we say, perhaps creative destruction, something perhaps very messy, but that might help identify why it is that the EU, what it is that the EU can provide for future generations. I mean, we've had a narrative about the EU, peace, democracy, and prosperity, which resonated for several decades, but it no longer resonates with the younger generation. We are going through a crisis of democracy, which EU institutions and the member states and citizens need to address. And the Conference on the Future of Europe could be a space to do that without necessarily a specific end game in mind. Eventually, treaty reform will be needed, but it's at the moment all political parties are allergic to the thought. No country is going to spearhead it. So we need to. That has to be, in the sort of long-term distance. For now, perhaps if we could orchestrate some real, solid, in-depth, messy discussions about what the EU is for, that I think could generate a process which could eventually lead to new ideas for Europe's future.
Rosa, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time and for this interesting conversation. Thanks to the Martens Center for making this podcast possible. And thank you all for listening. We will be back soon with a new episode of Her and EU, so stay tuned.
That was today's episode of Her and EU. Subscribe to our podcast for more.